What if the pain you've been carrying wasn't a mistake? What if the heartbreak, the loss, the failure were actually sacred signs from something deeper, something wiser? These aren't just poetic questions. They might be the keys to decoding a hidden architecture beneath the surface of your life. Carl Jung once said, "What you do not make conscious will manifest as fate." This quote isn't just psychological insight, it's a spiritual blueprint. Because when the soul wants to awaken you, it often doesn't use comfort. It uses crisis, discomfort, disillusionment, tools of sacred transformation. In this video, we're going to explore why the breakdowns in your life may have actually been breakthroughs in disguise. How that relationship ending wasn't a punishment, it was a redirection. How that rejection wasn't about your worth, it was about timing. How those moments you felt completely lost were actually when you were being rerouted toward your deepest truth. From the perspective of the ego, these experiences look like chaos, failure, or abandonment. But from the perspective of the soul, they are messages, crafted not in words but in symbols, archetypes, and strange synchronicities. Your life is not random. There is an invisible intelligence that speaks through closed doors, through sudden endings, through emotional collapse. Jung believed that the self, the divine core within us, is always trying to emerge. But for that to happen, the ego must soften, even collapse. The structures we built around who we think we are must break, so the truth of who we really are can come forward. That's not a punishment. It's an initiation. And here's the paradox. The more we try to control our journey with logic, the more the soul uses mystery to pull us inward. The ego demands answers, linearity, and guarantees. But the soul speaks in whispers, in symbols, in the unfolding of time and presence and stillness. So what if your most painful moments weren't setbacks, but sacred steps in your awakening? What if what you've been calling a block was actually her blessing in disguise, guiding you, humbling you, preparing you for something your mind couldn't yet imagine? This isn't about romanticizing pain. It's about realizing that the darkness is not the opposite of light, but its womb. Healing begins not by escaping the night, but by honoring what it reveals. The journey of awakening isn't about fixing everything. It's about remembering, surrendering, and coming home to your soul. Let's dive in. The fall of the ego is rarely graceful. More often it feels like your life is coming apart at the seams. Plans dissolve, relationships crumble, identities collapse. But what if these moments are not signs of failure, but signals of transformation? The ego, by nature, craves control. It clings to definitions, achievements, and certainty. But the soul is not here to control. It's here to evolve. Carl Jung understood this tension deeply. He saw the ego as necessary, our conscious sense of self, navigating the outer world. But he also warned that if the ego dominates the psyche, it blocks the emergence of the self. And the self is not just a better version of you, it is the whole of you. The divine, the shadow, the light, the mystery. And the self doesn't speak the language of logic. It speaks the language of symbols. Your soul communicates not through spreadsheets or plans, but through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and sensations. It speaks when you're still, when you're lost, when you surrender. And often it has to interrupt your ego's agenda to get your attention. Think of the times you were blocked. You tried and tried, but the door wouldn't open. Maybe you blamed yourself. Maybe you felt defeated, but now with some distance, can you see that you weren't being punished? You were being rerouted. The block was not a stop sign. It was recalibration. Synchronicities, those strange, almost magical coincidences, are another way the soul speaks. A book falls off a shelf that answers your question. A stranger says the exact thing you needed to hear. You feel something stir inside you when you encounter certain symbols, animals, or numbers. These are not accidents. They're breadcrumbs on the path of awakening. Jung called this the symbolic life, a way of living where we pay attention to the deeper meaning behind our experiences. In the symbolic life, nothing is just random. Everything is a potential message from the unconscious or the divine. But to live this way requires a letting go, a surrendering of the ego's constant need for explanation and control. It means listening with more than your ears. It means allowing space for mystery and trusting that life is not just happening to you, it's happening for you. When life doesn't go as planned, the ego panics. It wants answers. It wants to fix. But the soul isn't looking for immediate solutions. It's looking for depth, for integration. It's trying to bring forward the parts of you buried under fear and denial. Sometimes, the only way those parts can surface is through disorientation. The ego sees this as a crisis. The soul sees it as an initiation. Every time your world collapses, there is also a door opening, though you may not see it right away. There's a sacred intelligence at work beneath the pain, an architecture too complex for the linear mind to grasp. This is why some of your biggest spiritual growth spurts come after loss, illness, or failure. Because it's in those cracks that the light finally enters. As the ego falls, something ancient begins to rise. You might notice your dreams becoming more vivid. You might feel drawn to certain books, practices, or teachers. You begin to question the narratives you inherited. You start asking deeper questions, not about what you want, but about who you really are. You might find that life becomes more vibrant, more interconnected. You notice synchronicities more often. You feel a pull toward nature, quiet contemplation. This isn't regression, it's sacred remembering. The soul doesn't rush. It unfolds. And as it does, it reveals truths you've always known but had forgotten. This is the voice of the soul awakening. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And to hear it, you have to become quiet enough to listen. This is why the ego must fall, not because it's bad, but because it's loud. And the soul needs stillness. So the next time you feel like your life is falling apart, ask yourself, what if this is the very moment I've been unconsciously preparing for? What if this isn't the end, but the unraveling of a false self? What if life in all its mystery is trying to help me come home? The fall of the ego isn't a punishment. It's the start of the most honest chapter of your life. One where the soul begins to speak louder than your fears. One where your story stops being about perfection and starts being about authenticity. And that shift, that quiet, seismic shift, is where real healing begins. Because when the soul takes the lead, life no longer feels like a series of random events. It becomes a conversation, a subtle guidance system rooted not in certainty, but in resonance. Every obstacle, every pause, every closed door becomes a divine signal pointing you inward. Pain is a strange teacher. It doesn't come with explanations. It arrives uninvited, often at the worst time, and it leaves behind a storm. But what if we've misunderstood its presence? What if pain isn't just something to survive, but something designed to reveal? Many of us have been conditioned to see suffering as punishment, as evidence that something has gone wrong. But from the soul's perspective, pain isn't a failure, it's a portal, a sacred signal that something hidden is ready to surface. The emotional wound is not where we are broken, it's where we begin to break open. If you look back at your life, you may notice a pattern. The moments that nearly destroyed you were the same moments that changed you: the loss of a loved one, the collapse of a dream, the betrayal, the illness, the burnout. They all cracked something open. And what came through the cracks wasn't just grief. It was light, compassion, awareness, sensitivity, a new level of strength you didn't know you had. This is the paradox of pain. It devastates, but it also activates. And it doesn't just activate your survival, it awakens your soul. It challenges the ego's script of linear success and introduces a spiral of growth, where descent is part of ascent. Jung understood this intimately. He saw that the descent into darkness, into shadow, is not a detour, it's a necessary passage. The soul grows not in perfection, but in depth. And depth comes through contact with the parts of life we usually avoid. Death, rejection, fear, despair. These aren't detours on the spiritual path. They are the path. They refine you. They humble you. They prepare you to hold more light. When you're inside the pain, it feels senseless, chaotic, you want it to end. But when you look back, you often find a strange coherence. The closed doors that devastated you led to deeper paths. The relationships that broke you opened your heart. The failure that humiliated you made you question your identity. And that Questioning became liberation. This is the secret pattern of pain. It's not random. It's orchestrated, not by fate in a punitive way, but by the deep intelligence of your soul, which knows what must die in order for the essential to be reborn. Sometimes you're not meant to succeed in a certain direction, not because you're not worthy, but because that path would have pulled you away from your truth. The universe doesn't reward attachment to illusions. It rewards surrender to authenticity. That's why the people who carry the most wisdom often carry the deepest scars. Not because they were stronger than others, but because their suffering was metabolized into meaning. They didn't let pain harden them. They let it initiate them. In spiritual terms, this is known as the wounded healer archetype, the one who, through confronting their own darkness, becomes a source of light for others. They don't offer advice from a pedestal. They offer presence from experience. They don't say, "This is what you should do." They say, "I've walked that path, I'm with you." The pain you carry, if faced and felt, can become that kind of medicine. But only if you stop judging it. Only if you allow it to speak. Because pain has language. It speaks through the body, through dreams, through anxieties that seem irrational until you trace them back to forgotten wounds. When you stop numbing it, stop resisting it, and simply sit with it, it begins to reveal its purpose. And the more you do this, the more you start seeing patterns. Not just in your own story, but in life itself. You realize that obstacles are often protections, that what felt like rejection was divine timing, that silence wasn't abandonment, it was an invitation to listen more deeply. You begin to see the structure underneath the storm. You understand that you weren't being destroyed, you were being prepared to love more honestly, to live more deeply, to trust the invisible more than the visible. And somewhere along this path, something miraculous happens. You stop resenting your pain. You begin to revere it. You begin to thank the night for teaching you to see. You begin to honor your heartbreak as the doorway that opened your heart. This doesn't mean you wanted the suffering. It means you transformed it. You alchemized it. You took the raw material of life, grief, fear, loneliness, and turned it into wisdom, empathy, resilience. This is spiritual maturity, not perfection, not bliss, but the capacity to hold life in its full spectrum, to meet the dark without losing the light, to say, "This too belongs." And in that acceptance, the pain begins to shift. It doesn't vanish, but it softens. It no longer controls you. It becomes part of your story. Not the whole story, but an important chapter. One that shaped your soul into something more real, more alive, more connected. You may even start to see that the pain was never the problem. The resistance to it was. The story you told yourself about what it meant, that you failed, that you were broken, that life was unfair, was the real weight. And when that story dissolves, what remains is presence, compassion, spaciousness. This is the secret pattern. Pain leads to presence. Loss leads to clarity. The wound leads to wisdom. Every breakdown is also a potential breakthrough if you let it be. There's a voice inside each of us that wants to be heard, but it doesn't yell, it doesn't demand, it whispers. And that's precisely why it's so hard to hear, because there's another voice, louder, faster, more persistent, that drowns it out. That voice is the ego. The ego is not the enemy. It's a necessary construct that helps us navigate the world. It's the part of us that plans, defends, achieves, compares. But left unchecked, it can become a tyrant. It wants control, certainty, validation, and it's terrified of surrender. The soul, on the other hand, doesn't care about control. It cares about truth. It doesn't operate on timelines or social approval. It speaks through intuition, through quiet nudges, through the calm that suddenly descends when you're aligned. It's soft, but it's strong. And when you learn to listen to it, your entire life begins to shift. One of the greatest challenges in the spiritual path is distinguishing these two voices. The ego is loud but not always wise. The soul is quiet but deeply knowing. And the way to tell the difference is this. The ego speaks in fear. The soul speaks in love. The ego says, "You have to figure it out now. You're behind. You're failing. The soul says, breathe. You are exactly where you need to be. Nothing real is ever lost. The ego screams for explanation. The soul invites trust. In crisis, the ego panics. It tries to force outcomes. It creates endless mental loops, rehearsing conversations, predicting disasters. The soul stays silent, patient. It waits until you're quiet enough to hear. It often guides through feelings, not logic, through resonance, not reason. You've probably felt this before. The moment you ignored a gut feeling only to regret it later, or the time you followed an inner knowing that made no sense yet turned out perfectly. That's the soul in action. It doesn't need evidence. It just knows. But to trust it, you have to unlearn everything the ego has taught you. That your worth depends on performance. That your value comes from comparison. That success is linear. That life is about answers, not questions. These beliefs are prisons dressed as protection. The ego wants you to avoid pain, avoid risk, avoid failure. But in doing so, it also makes you avoid growth. The soul doesn't avoid those things, it walks with them. It welcomes them as part of your evolution. When you begin to live from the soul, your life may look less impressive on the outside, but it feels more real on the inside. You may say no to opportunities that don't resonate. You may disappoint others to honor your own rhythm. You may choose presence over productivity. And in that choice, you begin to reclaim your power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to align. The power to live in integrity with your own truth. This is the quiet revolution of the soul. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be understood. It just needs you to be radically, courageously honest. Honest about what matters most in your life right now. Honest about what hurts. Honest about what you're afraid of and what you're longing for. Because when you get honest, the ego can no longer manipulate you. It can no longer use fear to drive your decisions. You become anchored, not in external validation, but in inner knowing. And that knowing becomes your compass. Not because it gives you a map, but because it restores your trust in the pathless path, in the unfolding, in the mystery. The soul doesn't rush, it doesn't push, it doesn't strive. It whispers, it nudges, it flows. And when you follow it, life begins to feel less like a battle and more like a conversation. You stop needing everything to make sense. You start needing everything to feel true. You no longer need every answer. You just need the next step. And that step always reveals itself when you pause, when you breathe, when you soften. So when the noise gets loud, when your mind is racing, your chest is tight, your decisions feel frantic, ask yourself, who's speaking right now? Is it fear or is it love? Is it control or is it trust? Return to the breath, return to the body, to presence, to what is real. Return to the silence underneath the shouting, because that's where the soul lives. Not in the chaos, but beneath it. Not in the doing, but in the being. And when you listen, truly listen, you realize it's been guiding you all along. Not with commands, but with invitations. Not with pressure, but with quiet encouragement. Not with force, but with freedom. The soul whispers, the ego shouts, but everything begins to shift the moment you decide to listen differently and choose which voice to follow. There's a moment on the spiritual path that changes everything. It doesn't come with lightning bolts or grand revelations. It arrives quietly, like a soft breeze through a heavy room. It's the moment you stop fighting yourself, the moment you stop judging who you were and begin to hold yourself with compassion. For most of us, the journey begins with pain, and from that pain, the ego creates stories. I messed up. I failed. I wasn't enough. These narratives become internal prisons. We replay them, we reinforce them, we wear them like armor. But what if those stories weren't the truth? What if they were simply expressions of a limited consciousness doing the best it could? Carl Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or hide. And one of the most profound teachings he offered is that healing doesn't come from rejecting the shadow, but from integrating it. This means looking at the most painful aspects of ourselves not as enemies, but as exiled children, waiting to be brought home. When you begin to see your mistakes not as signs of weakness, but as calls for awareness, something miraculous happens. The shame begins to melt, the blame begins to dissolve, And in its place, compassion begins to rise, real compassion, the kind that says, "Of course you didn't know better. You were in pain, you were lost, and you were trying to survive." This shift from judgment to compassion is alchemy. It doesn't erase the past, but it transforms your relationship to it. You no longer carry it as a burden. You carry it as wisdom. And with that wisdom comes softness. You begin to speak to yourself differently. The harsh inner critic begins to quiet down. The pressure to be perfect loosens its grip. You start asking kinder questions. What did I need back then? What was I afraid of? How can I love that part of me now? This doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. True compassion includes accountability, but it also includes context. It understands that the version of you who made that decision, who acted out of fear, who didn't know how to ask for help, that version of you was doing the best they could with the tools they had. When you see yourself through that lens, you stop needing to be flawless. You stop performing. You become more real. And in that realness, you make space for healing. Not just for yourself, but for others too. Because when you practice compassion inwardly, it flows outward. You begin to see others not just for what they do, but for what they carry. You become less reactive, more understanding, less quick to judge, more willing to listen. This is one of the most underrated forms of spiritual maturity. Not how enlightened you appear, but how gently you hold the parts of yourself you once hated. How tenderly you sit with your own shame, your own confusion, your own unmet needs. And here's the miracle. When you sit with those parts long enough, they stop screaming. They stop sabotaging. They stop hijacking your life. Because what they needed all along wasn't punishment, it was presence. It was your love. The process of integrating the shadow is not linear, it's cyclical. You'll revisit the same themes, the same wounds, but each time you'll meet them with more awareness, more breath, more grace, and that grace becomes your new way of being. Eventually, the stories you told yourself begin to shift. I'm a failure becomes I'm human. I'm broken becomes I'm healing. I'm not enough becomes I am worthy as I am. These aren't affirmations you force yourself to believe. They're truths that start to feel real in your body, in your breath, in your nervous system. Because compassion doesn't just change your mind. It changes your physiology. Your body begins to relax, your heart begins to open. And in that opening, something ancient is remembered, that you were never unlovable to begin with. You realize that your pain doesn't make you less divine. It makes you more relatable, more grounded, more real. It gives you depth. It gives you substance. It gives you the kind of presence that doesn't need to impress, because it simply is. And perhaps most beautifully, compassion gives you access to a deeper sense of connection. To yourself, to others, to life. You stop needing to fix everything. You stop needing to have all the answers. You learn to hold the mystery. You learn to be with what is. This is the alchemy of self-judgment into compassion. It's not flashy. It's not always visible. But it's powerful and it's sacred. It's the quiet revolution that turns pain into presence, wounds into wisdom, and shame into sacredness. And once you've experienced this, you can never go back to the old way. You may still stumble, still struggle, still fall, but you rise differently. You rise with softness, with clarity, with love. You become a safe place for yourself and for others. You become someone who doesn't just talk about healing, you embody it. And in embodying it, you become a living reminder that we don't heal by becoming perfect. We heal by becoming whole. There's a point in the journey where everything changes, not because your circumstances suddenly become perfect, but because your perspective does. You stop seeing your wounds as curses and start seeing them as credentials. Not credentials in the eyes of the world, but in the realm of the soul. The story of the wounded self is one many of us know intimately. It's the version of you that felt broken, ashamed, lost. The part that thought it was too late, that no one would understand, that healing was for someone else but not for you. That version of you is not your failure. It's your foundation. Because what happens when you walk through the fire and survive, when you cry on the floor and still wake up the next morning, is that something in you deepens, something solidifies. You stop needing to be shiny. You start needing to be true. And in that truth, something miraculous happens. You begin to shift from being someone who needs saving to someone who becomes safe. Safe to be around, safe to speak to, safe to break in front of. You carry a presence that doesn't fix but understands, that doesn't preach but listens. This is how the wounded self becomes the guide. Not because they've figured everything out, but because they've stopped pretending they need to. Because they've touched the depths of their own sorrow and found something holy there. And when you find that sacred ground in yourself, you start to recognize it in others. You see past their defenses. You feel the grief behind their anger. You hear the longing inside their silence. You stop needing to change people and start choosing to witness them. This witnessing is medicine. In a world obsessed with answers, being witnessed in your truth, without judgment, without advice, is rare. And it's transformative. It says, "You're not alone, I see you, I've been there, and I'm still here." That's the power of the one who's been through the fire. Their healing becomes a beacon, not because they're perfect, but because they're real. Their presence carries something words cannot fake, embodied compassion. And this doesn't require a title. You don't need to be a therapist, a teacher, a guru. You just need to be available. To your own heart, to your own pain, to your own truth. From that place, your very existence becomes a lighthouse. It's not about being a hero. It's about being human. Fully, tenderly, consciously human. And in a world that's starving for authenticity, your humanity is your greatest offering. You become someone others feel safe around, not because you have all the answers, but because you've made peace with your own questions, because you've learned how to sit in discomfort without fleeing, because you've stopped hiding the parts of you that once felt unacceptable, and slowly, without even trying, you begin to guide. Through your silence, through your stillness, through the way you pause before reacting, through the way you allow space instead of forcing certainty. You become a guide not by effort, but by example, not by being unshakable, but by being open. Your presence becomes the permission others didn't know they were looking for. Permission to feel, to slow down, to speak honestly, to not have it all together. To remember that healing doesn't look like perfection, it looks like presence. This shift from the wounded self to the guiding soul is not a destination, it's a passage. And you walk it over and over. Every time you choose truth over image, every time you choose vulnerability over defense. Every time you choose to stay present when it would be easier to disconnect. And over time your story transforms. What once felt like scars become maps. What once felt like darkness becomes depth. What once felt like a burden becomes your medicine. You realize that your pain has a place, not to define you but to refine you, not to keep you stuck but to keep you real. You stop trying to be the light, and instead you become a space where light can be remembered. And this, perhaps, is the greatest service you can offer. Not fixing, not saving, but being. Being in a way that invites others to remember their own wholeness. Being in a way that reminds others that their wounds are not the end of their story. They are the beginning of something sacred. So if you've felt broken, lost, ashamed, if you've ever questioned your worth or doubted your strength, know this: you are not behind. You are becoming. Every tear, every trial, every quiet moment of rising again has brought you here, to this moment, to this presence, to this possibility. You are not who you were. You are not your mistakes. You are the awareness that grew from them, the tenderness that survived them, the strength that arose in the silence after the fall. And now you carry something priceless, not answers, not perfection, but presence. And in a world full of noise, presence is revolutionary. This is how the wounded self becomes the guide, quietly, gently, truthfully, not with declarations, but with embodiment, not with force, but with love. Your life, exactly as it is already enough to be medicine for someone else, and the more you live that truth, not speak it but live it, the more others will begin to remember their own. You are not here to impress. You are here to express. You are not here to pretend. You are here to remember. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be whole. Your path, with all its twists and bruises, is not random. It's a sacred curriculum. Every moment of doubt, every heartbreak, every breakthrough was part of your preparation, Not just for your own healing, but to serve others simply by being who you are. You didn't go through all that just to go back to sleep. You went through it to wake up. And now you're here, awake, available, anchored, and truly alive.